Welcome everybody to CogX and welcome to the Economy and Future of Work stage. I'm delighted to introduce to you our next event, which is the Economic Singularity Club. If you would like to tweet about the event, please tweet at CogX 2020 and also consider tweeting for our sponsors, the Institute for the Future of Work at @_Future of Work. The moderator for this event is Radhika Chadwick. Radhika joins us here at CogX in her capacity as co-founder of the Economic Singularity Network, which looks at the long-term impact of AI in society. A career-long technologist and strategist, Radhika has spent 25 years helping large organizations and governments, in particular, tackle complex strategic problems. She speaks regularly on topics around AI, disruption, public sector reform, and diversity in technology. And I'm going to hand over Radhika now to introduce our distinguished panel.
Thank you very much, and good evening, CogX, and welcome to your session with the Economic Singularity Club. What is this club, you ask? Well, we are a diverse and independent network of people with a personal interest in the topic of where technology is taking us. We have academics, technologists, authors, journalists, film producers, leaders from industry and startups, as well as government, think tanks, and the third sector. And in addition to ferociously debating the end of the world as we know it, we also occasionally have some fun together, probably last evidence by publishing a collection of creative writing called Stories from 2045. Scintillating read, said nobody yet, but there is still time. We are delighted to have three eminent thinkers from our network today who will be leading us through a crunchy conversation on AI and the specter of technological unemployment in a post-pandemic world. Frey is an economist and an economic historian and a fellow at Oxford University. He co-wrote the 2013 paper, which kickstarted the current round of debate about the prospect of technological unemployment. The paper concluded that about half of all US jobs, I think 47% is what you said, Carl, could probably be automated within 20 years or so. But it left open a really big question of whether those jobs would be replaced or lost. Carl's also recently published a very well-received book called The Technology Trap, which describes the extreme disruption caused by the Industrial Revolution, and it stands as, I think, a warning against ignoring the transition that we're currently going through. Jackie Ashley is chair of the National Brain Appeal and has been for several decades, hello Jackie, one of the UK's leading political journalists. Jackie started her career at the BBC and has worked for ITV, Channel 4, The New Statesman, and The Guardian. And she also has a very close interest in the issue of training and education, because until recently, she was president of Lucy Cavendish College in Cambridge. And finally, Calum Chace. He's a global keynote speaker and best-selling author on the subject of artificial intelligence. His books include Surviving AI and The Economic Singularity, and he champions the idea that an economy of abundance is the best outcome of technological unemployment. I believe he might have also minted the phrase fully automated luxury capitalism, a tantalizing prospect, and I'm sure Calum will tell us all about it. We would love to see you participate through either the forum, on Slido, or on Twitter, and we'll be on the lookout for your comments and challenges. If you'd like to have a question addressed in the Q&A session, it does need to be on Slido, but please put your comments on Twitter as well. Use the hashtag CogX2020, as well as the hashtag ESC. We have a scant 45 minutes today, so let's jump straight in. So Carl, lay it on us. Is technological unemployment going to happen? And what, if anything, has this pandemic changed?
Well, I think what the pandemic has done is clearly accelerating a number of trends in technology, and one of them is automation. We know that automation has been progressing for at least 200 years, in fact, even more, but it hasn't been happening at steady pace. Automation has often come in spurts. One such spurt was the last recession, the Great Recession, where we saw that routine rule-based jobs that can easily be automated disappeared at a particularly rapid pace, and they never really came back. the places where those jobs disappeared have still not really recovered. And the simple reason for that is that during recessions, businesses try to cut costs, and that tends to accelerate automation. We are now in another recession, and the IMF predicts that the global economy will shrink by 3% this year. And we are likely to see similar cost cutting using automation as a consequence of that. We also know that during recessions, consumers tend to opt for cheaper goods and services that use more automation technology. So if consumers go to McDonald's rather than to fancy restaurants, for example, they increase the level of automation in the economy by opting for goods that are produced using more automation technology. And that tends to happen during recessions. In addition to that, this is not just a normal recession, it's a pandemic-induced recession. And we are living at a time where physical distancing is required. And we see more robots being adopted in hospitals. We're seeing more delivery robots being developed. And we're seeing more automation technology being used in warehouses, which have been particularly overcrowded, where order picking has remained a very laborious process, at least up until now. But I think robotic hands are getting much better. Artificial intelligence is making object recognition much more pervasive. And this is clearly a domain in which automation is going to accelerate. That said, I do think that while the pandemic will accelerate automation in the short run, it is likely to slow down the pace of innovation with more long-lasting effects on technological development. And it's likely to do so in numerous ways. First of all, we know that venture capitalists during downturn tend to sort of shift and look at more of their existing investments in their portfolio rather than taking on new ones, which is going to slow down innovation. We know that one of the key drivers of innovation over the past 200 years have been people meeting and interacting in cities, whether you think of Renaissance Florence, Victorian Birmingham and Manchester, early 20th century Detroit, or contemporary Silicon Valley and Seattle. There's a reason that innovation has always been highly clustered. And the reason for that is that people benefit from knowledge spillovers by interacting with each other. And the reason is that, if you meet 10 really bright people, those people in those cities will have also met 10 really bright people, and good ideas filter down to you. So they perform a very important filtering mechanism, which spurs innovation. But obviously, at the time of physical and social distancing, we are likely to see less of that. And that is going to be bad for innovation over the long run. We are also likely to see less immigration as a result of this, and we are seeing some very worrying signs in the United States in particular for this. And immigration has really been one of the key drivers of innovation for over 2 centuries now. And so a slowdown in immigration would be really worrying for technological change. And more fundamentally even, I think what we are likely to see is very much a reversal of the shift we've seen in global value chains from Western economies, sort of offshoring production, to low-cost destinations like China. And with escalating tensions between the United States and China, we're likely to see more reshoring as a consequence. Now, why is that bad for innovation? Well, the simple reason is that global value chains has been one of the key facilitators of knowledge transmission. Before that, Western companies had no incentives to really improve technology on mass scale in developing countries. With global value chains, all of a sudden, an incentive to offshore technology and know-how reduces the prospect for technological unemployment over the long run, one would think, but that is sort of putting maybe a positive spin on it. It's really a very bad thing to have, the prospect of a significant slowdown in innovation. And I think actually that the likelihood or the prospect of technological unemployment is less likely to come for extraordinary rapid advances in technology, but if anything, a shift in consumer behavior or consumer preferences. So if you think about agriculture, for example, we've seen very substantial uptake of automation technology in agriculture, and obviously our response in consumption has been limited because there's only so much food you can consume, right? You can only eat until you burst. So there's a sort of upper limit on, how much more food we demand as food gets more automated and cheaper. But the same hasn't really been true for services, and there has been no sign whatsoever about the saturation point in our demand for new types of in-person services so far. And I think the key concern going forward is that many of the leisure complements, many of the in-person service sector type of jobs that we've demanded in large numbers so far is going to be diminished because we're going to travel less, because we're less likely to go to restaurants, because we're less likely to go to the gym, at least until the vaccine arrives. So the combination of low demand for services and potentially accelerating automation in those domains, I think raises the prospect for technological unemployment, at least in the short run.
Fascinating. So I'd love to invite everybody to join in and ask your questions, but perhaps I can kick off with the first question, Carl. So you're talking about a pandemic that will accelerate automation in the short term and significantly slow down the prospect of innovation in the longer term. What can governments do? What can corporations do, recognizing that this is likely to happen and recognizing that innovation is one of the key drivers of productivity and of growth?
Well, I think the first thing to realize and the first thing to try to avoid is zero-sum thinking, right? So we often fall back into this thinking of the medieval economy that was hit by the Black Death, in which lots of people passed away, and that led to more land per person and higher wages as a consequence of that. This was a terrible, terrible thing, but many people point to the fact that more land per person led to higher incomes during that period of time. In a knowledge-driven economy, the opposite is true. The more people you have, the more likely you are to see that somebody will make discoveries. The more interconnected a population and knowledgeable a population is, the more transmission of ideas and innovation you will have. And when you think about things like global value chains and immigration in particular, it's very important to remember that it's not a zero-sum game, right? These are global facilitators of knowledge flows that have been driving much of the growth we've seen for the past 3 decades or so. And it would be enormously harmful to innovation to reverse that trend.
So, Calum, Jackie, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, can I just come in here? Can you hear me all right? I'm afraid in these modern times, my internet is playing up, wouldn't you know it? So I did miss a little bit of it, but I hope you can hear me all right. It's flickering at me in an alarming way. Carl, I was just thinking, I know you say that there will be less sort of mixing of people in cities, in places, but I mean, one thing I've been struck by is that now we're all getting much more used to remote working, which has its pros and its cons. Suddenly we're actually mixing more, surely, aren't we? So, for example, say you've got a startup in Silicon Valley. In the old days, you could only employ people who lived within a certain radius of Silicon Valley. Now you could have someone from Nigeria, from Belgium, from Uzbekistan, all coming in with their ideas, which are going to be much more sort of varied and dynamic, I'd have thought, than just having the same little pool of people, dare I say it, mainly white, mainly male, mainly young, in Silicon Valley. So you're kind of actually increasing the mix of ideas flowing, surely.
Well, I think you're certainly right in the sense that digital technology allows ideas to flow more freely, and that is a great thing. The problem is, though, that much of the innovation happens through spontaneous interactions. This is not planned events. And digital communication requires somebody to switch on the computer or to pick up the phone and to plan the interaction in advance. And there's a reason for why innovation throughout human history always been extremely localized. It tends to diffuse, and digital technology has allowed ideas to spread more rapidly, but new ideas and innovation tend to emerge in a local fashion. And I don't think that is going to change in the future. Now, you can do certain tasks very well at distance if you already sort of settled on a product or settled on a business idea that you are executing. But that is very different from coming up with something entirely new. So I think that, at the later stage in the product lifecycle, when ideas become more standardized and commoditized, yes, you can easily communicate them across space. And, we are all here exporting our ideas right now to a global platform. But I think that there's a reason why innovation in history has tended to be very localized, and it's actually even more localized in the places that uses digital technology the most, like Seattle and Silicon Valley.
Mm-hmm. So what you're talking about, Carl, is a significant shift in our working habits. And regardless of whether or not we actually reach technological unemployment, we're already looking at those shifts happening now. What does history teach us about what works and what doesn't work, and how we tackle and how we deal with this shift?
Well, I think what history teaches us, first of all, is that during a crisis like this, accelerating technological progress can lead to enormous disruption and sometimes even a backlash against the technology itself. So there's no coincidence, for example, that the Luddite riots happened during the Continental Blockade, when Napoleon blocked all ports in Europe, essentially, which caused enormous disruption to British trade. And in addition to that, with the acceleration of mechanization, led a lot of people to riot against the mechanized factory. It's no coincidence that the Roosevelt administration introduced many restrictions on the introduction of machinery in the National Recovery Act during the Great Depression. So I think that in times of very rapid technological change, in times of recessions, the consequence is often a backlash, and we need to try to at least stabilize and hopefully stimulate the economy to get out of this.
Indeed. Calum, you're done quite a bit of thinking and writing on the idea of panics and backlashes. What are your thoughts on what we should be doing post-pandemic to ensure that we're on track with innovation and not slowing down?
My thinking about panic is further ahead. It's when we get to the point where it becomes apparent that technological unemployment really is going to happen, which is more in the 20 to 40 year time horizon than immediately after this pandemic. The thing I thought was really interesting, Carl, in what you said was how social distancing might reduce innovation. And I think that's a very good point. And if we do find ourselves doing more remote working, I think that could have a dampening effect on innovation, because I agree with you that when you were replying to Jackie just now, communicating via Zoom and other video teleconferencing channels are available, isn't as good as doing it in person. You can't just chill out with a group of people, bounce ideas around, shoot the breeze, and then a nifty idea pops up. We're not anywhere near the death of geography yet. And if the pandemic accelerates the growth of remote working, that really could slow down innovation quite a bit. That's an interesting thought.
What we need is some way of having a sort of a chilled out hangout, a water cooler time, isn't it? Rather than these
and it's called
Zoom meetings.
Yeah, it's called the holodeck from Star Trek.
Right.
We won't use it for a few decades at least. Geography isn't going to die until somebody invents really, really good immersive virtual reality.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's a space in the market for somebody to invent a few water coolers for us, online virtual water coolers for us.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So, Carl, how do you square your point on long-term innovation with the speed of change lately, working from home and telemedicine? This is a question that's come up on Slido.
Well, I think you have to look at the economy as a whole. So it's absolutely clear that there will be, innovation in certain domains as a result of this. Telemedicine is one, online education is another, where I think that the take-up of technology is going to accelerate as a consequence of this pandemic. But the point is more about long-run growth and long-run innovation. And if you think that people interacting drives innovation, if you think that knowledge flows across space drives innovation, and if you think that our collective brain, if you like, is likely to be less collective and more fragmented as a consequence of this, that will be harmful for innovation, even though there might be an acceleration in some domains. If you look at some really big events in history, like World War II, a lot of people seem to think that actually spurred innovation. But it did not. It reduced productivity growth during the war, and it reduced innovation during the war. Now, it's easy to point to some innovations that came out of it and say, look at these innovations, we wouldn't have had those before. But the counterfactual is important. And the fact is that during the war, some of the brightest scientists in the United States were tied into what's called the Manhattan Project. They were trying to develop the atom bomb before Nazi Germany. Now, that is not the most productive way of using your talent and resources. And one other worry, I think, is that the escalation of tensions between the United States and China could similarly cause a shift in innovation from productive purposes to destructive purposes. Now, that is not to take away the benefits of telemedicine and online education, but they are still a small part of what's happening in the overall economy.
I think that's a fascinating point about aggregate innovation and also productive versus destructive innovation. Shall we into our next topic and come back to this at the end, Jackie? So you were going to lead us through a bit of a conversation on if technological unemployment does happen, how do we deal with accelerated job churn?
Thank you, Radhika. Well, yes, job churn, I think, is a very interesting concept because for people of my age, and I stopped my clock at 39, but I am a tad older than that, I'll admit. People of my generation, we were brought up to think that we would have one job, one career. If you left school at 16 or 18, you became a plumber or a bricklayer. My uncle was a bricklayer. Or if you went to university, you become a lawyer or an accountant. And that was what you did. And you did that for 40 years. And then you retired, if you were lucky, with a good pension. And that was very much your identity. It is what you did. And, you didn't really think to change that. I went into journalism and I was a journalist for nearly 40 years. And it's only as I approached the end of my working life that I've done a few different things. I went to run a Cambridge college, which was fascinating and put me in touch with the aspirations of young people today. And now I'm running a charity, which again is something I didn't envisage doing, but I'm really loving those new challenges. So I think towards the end of my life, I'm beginning to see what will be the reality for my children and for my former students who are in their sort of 20s and 30s. And I think they will have to expect many different changes of job, of profession, of trade during their lifetimes, because who would have thought even 10 years ago that, say, accountancy, the law, taxi driving, all these jobs are going to be really seriously affected by automation. And so people can't rely on having a job for life in these spheres. I was very interested talking to a group of law students a year or so ago, and I said, well, there are big changes coming in automation in the legal profession. So how do you see your career 20 years on? And they weren't really sort of accepting that this was going to happen. It's, oh, well, it may happen, it may not. But I think it will. And I think certainly some lawyers training away so hard today will have to expect to change careers. Now, my contention is that schools and universities are not doing nearly enough to prepare today's young people for this sort of change of lifestyle, really. An idea that you might expect several different careers during the course of your working life. Certainly, a lot of the courses still taught at Cambridge, where I've just been, are the same as they were when I was a student. I did PPE at Oxford, that dreaded degree, which has produced so many bad politicians and journalists. But it's still the same course virtually now, and they're not really focusing on the skills needed. And I believe what we do need now is to teach students different skills completely. We need to teach resilience because, you know, when you lose a job, it's tough. We need to teach agility, the ability to think of what you might want to do that would satisfy you in other ways, creativity. All these various skills that really no one ever focuses on in either schools or universities. And, you know, we need to start questioning whether modern languages should be studied at university, because some people are predicting that the translate system will be so brilliant that you'll have in your ear instantaneous translation. So why spend 3 years at university studying German when you just have this little app? But these sort of thoughts aren't entering the university world, I don't think, nearly as much as they should be. They're still focusing on the traditional subjects. Yes, of course, some things have changed, but not nearly enough. So I think that's what we need to focus on. Second, we need to focus on how people learn. There's still too much spoon feeding of learning. Even at our great universities, there's a curriculum, you learn it, you spit it out for your exams. Instead, we have to teach people how to pick up new skills. And I'm noticing this a lot with the tech generation. Rather than enrolling on a new course at a new college or something, if they need to reskill, they know how to do it because they just go online and they will pick up, I don't know, photography, graphic design, cookery, data management, all sorts of things. They'll pick it up by themselves. And again, that's something that the formal education authorities need to be teaching people as well. If you do need to reskill, that's the way to do it. You don't have to wait a year to get into a college to go and do a course. I think also this matter of identity, your identity is defined by what you do. So if you're a lawyer, you're obviously, you know, a great important person. I think as time moves on and we see people reskilling, a lot of people are, say, leaving, certainly my profession, journalism, and going to become personal trainers or cooks or garden designers. And they're finding a lot of job satisfaction in that. But there's that whole status issue, which I think is something else we need to be looking at. And we are learning, even the coronavirus crisis, I think, has taught us very different things about what we value in society. We now value much more the carers, the doctors, the nurses, the people caring for us. And I think all those things are going to change our idea of what is a good job, what is personally satisfying for us to do, and how we can retrain quickly if we need to. So I think a long way to go, really, on how we teach the young people of today particularly, but actually also the older people, because, you know, people in their 50s might suddenly have to reskill, retrain, that it's not the end of the world if your job disappears, that actually it's quite exciting. I had one uncle who was a town clerk for 40 years on Widnes Town Council. Every single day he went and sat at the same desk on the town council. Now you think how stultifying that is really compared to today's generation, who can be all sorts of things. A lawyer for a bit, maybe an entrepreneur for a bit, maybe a cook for a bit. I think it's a fantastic opportunity, but we do need to prepare people for the challenges ahead. And in particular, prepare that resilience and that, you know, ability to cope with the mental health side of things as well, which is still to this day really very neglected. So that's it for my short opening statements. Now let's open.
Fascinating. If I may jump into the first question, then Carl and Calum, please. You talk about schools not embracing the changes that are needed quickly enough, not just the changes in what they're teaching, but also how they're teaching it and why it's so important. And yet, you're from Cambridge and Oxford, and you mentioned PPE, some of the best, brightest thinkers in our country sit in and around the universities and the curriculum. But what is stopping us from moving ahead with the changes that we know we need?
Well, I can't speak so much for schools because I don't know that much about school education. But certainly in the universities, they are remarkably traditional. I think there is a slight sense of it was always done this way, and I studied this hard in this way, and that's the way it was done. When I was at Cambridge, I fought quite hard to stop these very intense 8-week terms and the long holidays, because I thought the pressure on students was enormous, and there was an awful lot of mental health issues, which that's the thing that most surprised me in Cambridge, is how many people were suffering with the pressure of the 8-week terms. But there was rather a sense that, we've always done it like this, and so we will continue to do so. I think people are not prepared to think outside of the box and to think that actually we do need to reform the skills we teach students, as well as the knowledge, but learning how to deal with knowledge, how to know what knowledge is, how to test knowledge, how to discern what is fake news. All these things are quite new, but they will take quite a long time, I fear, to percolate through to the syllabus and to the curriculum in schools and universities.
Fascinating. Calum, Carl, what are your thoughts on this?
So we do know some of the things that we need to do with education to improve it. It's a very, very conservative sector, probably more so in the universities than in schools. But in schools, for instance, we know that flipped learning, where you don't watch somebody give a boring lecture and then do homework where you try to figure out the examples yourself, you do it the other way around. So you watch a really good lecture online as your homework, and then you go into the class and your teacher coaches you through the exercises. That's flipped learning. Competency-based learning is where you study a topic until you've mastered it, and only then do you move on to the next one. And it doesn't matter how old you are, you move at the pace that you're achieving. There's various other things that have been known about for ages, but they haven't been adopted. Interestingly, they are being adopted in private schools in the UK. My son went to a state comprehensive school, and they didn't do this very much, but I know the private schools are adopting flipped learning and competency-based learning. So there are kind of experiments going on around the place, but there's a great deal of conservatism. So we need a good crisis. And this is the first in, no doubt, a series of good crises, which will shake education up.
I think you're right, Calum. I think the way children are now having to learn, it means inevitably the old ways are going out of the window, because they can't be in school and probably won't be for some time. So maybe, if people just think a little bit more laterally about how we can improve learning and what we teach and how we teach children how to learn, how to discover for themselves, I think it's a great opportunity. But you're right, that education is very traditional, and there's always this emphasis on the 3 R's almost, isn't there? We must go back to the traditional things, and how one deals with that, that's another big issue. Well, you have some ideas as a man from Oxford.
Our ways of teaching so far, that's for sure. And whether that will stick, time will tell. But I wanted to go back to a very different topic that I think is important and related as well, which is early childhood education. So there's enormous amount of evidence showing that children's ability to learn new skills later in life is very dependent on actually the quality and access to early childhood education. So do you have any thoughts on how that could be improved in particular?
Well, funnily enough, I do think there's a lot of scope there, because I think the people with very young children are much more prepared to try new ideas. They're not so keen. There's not this idea anymore that you must teach children to read by the age of 3 if you possibly can. And I think they are looking at more radical ideas, and perhaps, some policymakers could just have a look at that sector. But I think actually the people themselves running early years education they seem to have livelier minds, more interested minds in how we can make things different, more fun, engaging. So I think there's a bit of hope there. But you're absolutely right to identify those early years as the way to start teaching them how to learn.
Fantastic. And I think one of the most interesting data points I ran across recently is that the most widely accessed course in Coursera is Barbara Oakley's Learning How to Learn. Yeah. So there are obviously opportunities for people to learn how to learn outside of the traditional curriculum. Now we've got just about 10 minutes left, so let's bounce over to Calum. And Calum, let me ask you your question here, which is, how are you going to leave us hopeful? If technological unemployment is to be our reality, can you paint us a picture of a happy one, please?
I'll do my best. So if technological unemployment is coming, what is the best outcome and what policies should we pursue? So let's assume that Moore's law or something like it continues and the performance of our machines continues to double every 18 months or so. 30 years from now, our machines will be 1 million times more capable than the ones we have today. 1 million times. Now, there's no straight line correlation between a machine's processing power and its cognitive ability. Software is vital too, but the 2012 Big Bang and the huge subsequent success of deep learning is unlikely to be the last major step change in AI. It does seem likely, or at least possible, that machines 1 million times more capable than today's will be able to do most of the things that we do for money, cheaper, better, and faster than us. They won't necessarily be artificial general intelligences, and they won't necessarily be conscious. They'll just be very, very capable. And we should plan for this contingency, just in case. Humans could not compete in the job market with these machines. We could not get or keep jobs. So how would we survive? For an increasing number of people, the answer seems obvious. It's universal basic income, or UBI. And there have been various experiments with basic income, most recently in Finland, and they demonstrate that people get happier and healthier if they receive more money, which really shouldn't have surprised anybody. What none of these trials demonstrate is how to pay for UBI. And that's not surprising because it's really hard. One of the most thorough analyses of the economics was done a few years ago by the RSA. And they found that abolishing all pensions, all benefits, all income tax allowances, and raising taxes on the wealthy would raise enough money to pay all adults the equivalent of 14% of the average wage. And it wouldn't pay for any housing. The COVID pandemic has raised the profile of UBI enormously because there are countries, many countries, finding it necessary and possible to introduce measures of some sort of basic income. But they are only doing it for a few weeks, and the cost is staggering. In the words of the economist John Kay, if UBI is affordable, it's too low to be useful. If it's useful, it's unaffordable. In other words, it's too basic. People don't like hearing this, but it is true. A universal payment would also be regressive, making completely unnecessary payments to Boris Johnson's unknown number of children, and actually reducing payments to more needy folk. But while the U, the universal, and the B, the basic, of UBI are problematic, the I, the income, is on the right track. If we can't get income from jobs, we're going to have to get one from somewhere else. Now, an economy in which machines do all the jobs should be an economy of abundance. Humans are generally the most expensive part of the production process for any product or service, and that cost has been removed. Artificial intelligence will make the processes very efficient, optimizing the use of inputs and eliminating waste. And energy costs should be very low, thanks to the exponentially declining cost of solar power. The cost of a very comfortable standard of living can't be reduced to zero, but it can get close. This means that an economic transfer from the people and organizations with wealth and income to the rest of us need not be onerous. Goods and services wouldn't be free. There would still be prices and choices to make. And this is a good thing, because the market is the most effective means of resource allocation that we have ever invented. There would still be scarcity. There's only so many Rembrandts in the world, and original Aston Martin DB5s, and villas on palm-fringed white sand beaches. There will still be positional goods and services created with human imagination and flair. So everybody would have a great life, and some people could still get rich. What I'm painting is not a picture of communism. Communism means centralized power, and that means inevitable corruption and inefficiency. The recommendation is not fully automated luxury communism, but fully automated luxury capitalism. Now, this is a very different economy from ours, and it's rather a strange world. It's hard to imagine what it would be like, and that's why we call it the economic singularity. But it could be wonderful if we can manage the transition. The transition will be challenging and probably bumpy, so we would be wise to prepare for it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Calum. You say the transition will be challenging and bumpy. So how do we prepare for it? Well, what are the top 1 or 2 things you think we ought to be doing now to make this a slightly easier ride than it might otherwise be?
So one of the preconditions, I think, for making the transition successfully is a consensus that technological unemployment is going to happen and that there is a positive outcome available. Now, that consensus can't arrive at the moment because it's frankly quite a long way off. It's not coming in the next 5 years or 10 years. My guess is it will happen in around 30, but it could be out by several decades, to be honest. But as it approaches, I think we need to get a consensus that it's coming and that it can have a good ending, or not ending, but a good outcome. because otherwise we could have the panic that you referred to earlier, Radhika. Now, how do you develop a consensus like that? Well, the consensus that technological unemployment is coming will develop naturally. The consensus that there's that say abundance is a great outcome will require quite a lot of rigorous academic study. It needs a lot of people like Carl to work on questions like, is this feasible? Does it make any sense? And how do we get there? And it might be that abundance is not the right answer. It might be that there's some other variation of UBI. So they all will need a great deal of academic study. Milton Friedman wrote in a preface to one of his books that the purpose of academics, or at least one of the purposes of academics, is to develop and support a bunch of really good ideas and just leave them lying around so that when a crisis comes along and the politicians and everybody else look for the next good idea, there's some good ones lying around to use. And I think that's probably one of the main ways that we prepare for this transition.
Fantastic. Jackie, Carl, what are your thoughts on that? How do we prepare?
Yeah, well, Calum, can I just ask, because the UBI is one issue, but then assuming that were to happen, what would everybody actually do all day? Because I've been very struck even during the lockdown, the people who have been furloughed are not the happy ones. They you know, in theory, you think, oh, marvellous, they're being paid and they're not having to work. And, you know, they do their walk. And I dare say we wouldn't be locked down to the extent. But what does everyone do all day? And how do you solve that problem? Because I think that is as big a problem is how you keep people busy and occupied and fulfilled as how you feed and clothe them and pay their rent.
Yeah, I must admit, this always puzzles me slightly. You're right in that the question of meaning is something that worries a lot of people. It's the first thing that people worry about when they start to take the idea of technological unemployment seriously. And I never quite understand it. I don't know anybody who gets bored on holiday. And you and I,
holiday, you would, wouldn't you?
I'm sorry?
If you were on permanent holiday, you would get bored.
Well, how bored are you, Jackie?
I would be bored more than 2 months on holiday, definitely.
Jackie, how many times have you retired? I don't know about you. I've retired a few times and I've never got bored yet.
Well, I keep going back to work, you see, so I do get bored being at home.
Right. So I think perhaps there's a slightly cheat answer. One of the things that people do tend to do when they retire is they do tend to go back to work, but very often they don't get paid for it.
Yeah.
And, you know, some of us have the luxury of being able to do that, and that's very nice. But I always say, you know, there's two classes of people who show you do not need to have a job to have a meaningful life. One is comfortably off retired people, and I know a lot of them. They're very busy organizing plays and conferences and bridge parties and going for walks and whatever. And people find an inexhaustible number of things to do: learning languages, reading, climbing mountains, whatever. The other group that proves this, I think, is aristocrats. You know, for most of history, at least the last couple of thousand years, there have been aristocrats in many societies who had the best lives, and they didn't work. They were the only ones who didn't work, and they had the best lives. Everybody else had a horrible life.
Right, well, we've got about a minute or so remaining, so thank you very much. I had a few more questions for you, but perhaps we can go into the Q&A session and carry them on. Lots and lots of food for thought. I think we'll all remember this idea of, you know, the challenge of raising aggregate productive innovation rather than destructive innovation. The fact that we need to change our identity away from jobs and the role that our education systems, highly traditional, play in that. And you know, how wonderful it could be if we get this all done. Let me leave you with a very quick thought from architect, author, futurist Buckminster Fuller, who I think said we should do away with the absolutely specious notion that everyone has to earn a living. We keep reinventing jobs because of this false idea that everyone has to be employed at some kind of drudgery. The true business of people should be to go back to school and think about whatever it was they were thinking about before somebody came along and told them they had to earn a living. With that, we'll be around in the Q&A session to answer questions in about 15 minutes. If you have a ticket, please head over to the stage. Thank you very much for joining us in this discussion with the Economic Singularity Club.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.